It's 12 o'clock or 12:01 right now, so um we'll get started. Actually, before we get into today's content, I was just gonna say, if everyone would like to head over to Top Hat, we just have our beginning of session questionnaire. Just asking you how last week's assignments went. So if you guys want to head over to Top Hat, it's gonna be open by the time you guys get there. It's open right now. So if you guys want to just go over and answer that, that would be good. Um, how did you guys find the assignment? Otherwise, any questions about the assignment, anything like that? Before we get started today. As I did say for last week. Okay. Oops. Answered. For those of you who are just joining, I see a couple of people might have trickled in. We're just on Top Hat right now. It's in the pre-session quiz questionnaire. Just asking how you guys found last week's assignment. Okay, so we'll just close the quiz now. Just what you guys said. So looks like most of you guys said, oh, okay. Some of them said we're hard for Python and Cloud, some were great. That's good to hear. Good mix. And most of you guys for Bug Buster said it was hard. Wow, interesting. All right. Well, like I said, guys, and I always say if we have time at the end of the session, we can go over them if you guys want. If you guys have any questions about them, feel free to ask. But let's get started with today's content. So today's session overview is we are going to go over another application of software engineering. We're going to go over a way to check for mouse clicks. We're going to do a little bit of review of last week's content, and then the main focus of today's functions. Okay. We are starting to get into more complex topics, sorry. And it's important that you guys really pay attention in these next couple sessions, just because as we get near to the end, things start to get a little bit away from the beginner stuff and more into the more advanced topics. Yeah. So another application of software engineering is DeepBar, which is combining chemistry and machine learning. So drugs do their jobs by sticking to their target proteins in some ways. Stickiness can be thought as of a good indicator of effectiveness, right? But calculating this has always been computationally expensive. But scientists at MIT have figured out ways to use machine learning models to get the same results in a fraction of the time. Okay, and machine
هنا ميكا هنا. لا ولا انت.
guys, if thank you. Where was I? If you guys get into, say, a computer science degree or software engineering degree or any kind of programming, machine learning and machine learning models are things that you guys are going to cover a lot of, right? So those are done via programming, right? And using code to create those models. Okay. So a quick review of last week's content. So if you guys recall, range is a list of numbers that we talked about for our for loops, from 0 to 1 less than the number that we specify. Okay. So like if we do range 5, we're going to get a list of numbers from 0 to 4. This can be used to repeat a task a certain number of times, or it can be used to index a list, and it can be used to index multiple lists. Okay. Just going to continue on mouse input. So we talked about the mouse pressed function last week. I believe it was last week, maybe the week before, which just returns true if what's it called? If the mouse is pressed. Okay, so if any point in time the mouse you click a button on the mouse, it will return true. Okay, you can actually also redefine the mouse pressed function to do something else when the mouse is pressed. Okay. The way you need to do that is like how we define draw and setup functions. You just need to do def mouse pressed and then do something. So if you want to print mouse pressed, right, on your console, you can do that there. Okay. How do we use it, right? So again, let's say we add mouse press to our code the same way. We add mouse press the same way that we add setup and draw, right? We do def setup, def draw, def mouse press, define the code underneath. Okay. Whatever we write underneath the mouse pressed will run once mouse pressed, once a button on the mouse has been pressed. Okay. So in this example, right, instead of printing something, they're actually drawing a circle at that, what's it called? At the mouse X and Y location on the screen. Okay. So functions. Okay. So what is a function? So we've seen before how we used variables to reuse values that we've wanted to use, right? So like you guys remember that we used variables to say if we wanted to easily repeat some code, right? And we want to say change that code, we just use a variable, right? We use a variable, say as our base. If we're creating, say, multiple circles that are like 10 units apart, we can set X to the X coordinate of, say, the first one, and then add 10 to X each time. It makes it a lot easier to create a bunch of circles. Well, a function is similar, except for you can use it to, you can create your own functions to repeat a set of code. Okay, so that code can be anywhere from 1 to infinite lines long worth of code. Okay, it's used to repeat a single task for us. Okay, that's the main functionality of a function. Okay, and what's the point, right? Like, why use functions? Well, packaging blocks of code into functions, we can reuse that code a lot. So if you find yourself doing the same thing over and over again, right, it's really helpful to just throw it into a function and just call that function anytime you need to do that piece of code, right? Like one example I can think of that I've used a lot is like, if I say have like a long list of data, right, and instead of writing the for loop every time, I just create a function to print out that list every time. It's a little bit more efficient, and it saves me lines of code. Okay, using functions also makes our code much shorter. Okay, we don't need to rewrite, we just call the function, right? If you find yourself doing something, I say, more than twice, that's kind of a rule of thumb I've come across with. If you find yourself doing the same task more than twice, put it into a function. You're going to save yourself a lot of time. Okay. So this is just an analogy to help you guys understand functions. Okay. So the car has a lot of complex pieces, but each one is like a function. Okay. So we have like the gas pedal moves the car forward. We have the steering wheel, which change directions, and the brake pedal slow down. Okay. These components simplify what the car actually does to the user, so that for the user to use to do those things, like move the car forward, change directions, or slow down, it's very simple, right? They don't actually have to do the complex mechanisms that actually move the car forward, right? So like if you look at the gas being pressed, right? What's really happened is like you input or your foot presses the pedal, but what actually happens is like the gas flow to increase the end to increase your speed, right? Engine burns harder, the wheel spins with more force, right? But all you really all you really get is just the car. All you perceive is the car moving faster, right? So you're pushing your foot down to move the car forward, right? And all these things are happening internally in the car, right? But all you perceive is really just the car moving faster, right? Because that's all you want to, right? You're not actually going in, you're not burning the gas yourself, you're not running the engine harder directly, right? So that's kind of another way to think of a function. Okay. It allows us to really simplify our code and make it easier to read and understand. Okay. So we've already been working with functions. Okay. So some of the functions that we've been working with are like the print function. Okay. Any shape that we've ever made has been a function. The fill function is another one. Background is another. The three that we've worked with the most would be setup, draw, and run. More so setup and draw, right? Those are two functions that we have really been working with through the whole entirety of the course. Okay. And they just, excuse me, they just repeat code for us, right? The nice thing about the ones that are on the screen is that they do a single action, right? Print just prints hello world. Ellipse just draws a circle. Okay. We've also been working with some functions that give us return values. Okay, so like length, the length function, when you put a list in as an argument, right? When you put something between these two curved brackets, that's called an argument. We'll talk about that more later. But it returns an integer value, right? Which is the length of that list. Okay, so that's a return value. So you can see that we're setting here a variable to the length of my list, right? And list length will be a variable by the end or be an integer value once this code has run. Okay. You can see also too here we have random number is equal. If you guys remember, we talked about random, right? This will be a random integer between 0 and 10. Okay, random number will be a random num, sorry. Okay, so those are return values. That's kind of how you use a function to set a variable to a value, right? Or use the return value from a function, I should say, right? That's one way to use it. Okay, so again, why even use functions? All right, so let's say we have this code, and you guys can see that this is some pretty extensive code, right? You look like you're repeating the same task over and over and over again, right? And this is, I don't know, if I were to guess off the top of my head, 30 lines of code, roughly, maybe even more, maybe 40, maybe 50, who knows? Okay. And like, let's say on our screen, we wanted to print out a ton of houses, right? Well, without functions, this is how you'd have to do it. And this is pretty long. And it gets harder to understand what your code's actually doing the longer it is, right? So we can use a function to make our code much shorter, right? So you can see here in our setup function, we've actually changed it to say just draw house, right? And with the X and Y coordinates, right? And then inside draw house, this is what we're doing, okay? This code segment is the same as one of these, okay? This code here that we see on this screen just translates to this little segment here, right? With the definition of the draw house function here. Okay, you guys can see that is significantly less to read through, right? And much easier, much more time efficient to write as well. Okay. So this brings us to our first question, okay, of the day. So if you guys want to head over to Top Hat. But the question goes as follows. Which of the following is false? Okay, these are all pertaining to functions. Okay, so functions can be utilized as reusable chunks of code. Functions should be used to perform one specific action. Functions can only be called in draw, and there's no limit to how many times a function or how many times you can call a function. Okay, so if you guys want to head over to Top Hat, I will start that question. And the question is up. whenever you guys are ready. About a minute left, guys. Okay, the question is done. So let's go over the solution here real quick. Let's see what you guys responded. So most of you guys said functions can only be called in draw, and that indeed is true. Okay. Functions can be utilized as reusable chunks of code. Okay, that's one of the main reasons to actually have a function. Okay, so we know that's true. Functions should be used to perform one specific action. That is true as well, right? Like we want to you typically you use them to do one thing, right? That one thing may be a varying lengths of code, lines of code, but I mean it's typically used to do one specific thing. Okay. There's no limit on how many times you can call a function. There is no limit. We didn't really specify that, but if you've seen, we didn't also say that you couldn't, there was a limit to how many times you could call a function. And functions can only be called in draw. We know that's false. If we look in the previous slides that we went through here, we can see that we have a function that we defined inside setup. Okay. So to think that they can only be called in draw would be a pretty big limitation on something that's very efficient. Okay, so let's move on. So we can make our own functions. Okay, so we can have them do whatever we like, right? So the body of a function, which is the part underneath the code. Okay, this is kind of the generalized syntax for a function. Okay, contains the code that what we want it to do. Okay, so just to briefly go over it, right? You need the def, right? And then the name of your function, the two curved brackets, and then the colon. And then underneath, you need to have some code. Okay. If you don't have some code there, you're going to get errors. Okay. These are all the possible parts of a function that you can have, right? Some of them are required, some of them are not. Okay. The things that you need always is you need a name for the function. Okay. And you need a body. Okay. We'll talk about parameters and return values here in a bit, but they're not required. Okay. You don't need to have them in order for your function to run properly. But yeah, you just need a name and then you need some code underneath here. Okay. You have those two things, your function will run. You'll get no errors or anything like that. Okay. This is a nice little cheat sheet too. Kind of tells you where everything goes. If you're having trouble with functions, I would definitely have this up. Okay. This is very helpful. Okay. Does everyone understand the basic syntax for a function? Does everyone kind of understand that you need the def, you need a name, parameters, you don't need them, but you can have them, right? They go inside that bracket. You need a body and then possibly a return value. You also need that little indentation as well. Okay. Just like setup and draw. Okay. So function names, right? So this is what we want to call our function. It's generally like variables. It's good practice to name the variable something that you like that pertains to its use, right? So like if we create a function called greeting, right? And or if we create a function to say hello or something like that, it's again good practice to keep the name in relative terms to what you're doing, right? So if you're saying hello, that could be considered a greeting. So you could call your function greeting, right? Just makes it much more easier to read, helps you remember what each function's doing, right? But you guys can see that this function does not have any parameters or return value. Okay, sometimes we don't need one, right? Like I said. So functions also have a body, right? And again, this is the next part that's needed, and this is what your code actually does. Okay, so when your function gets called, this is what gets run. Okay, so in our greeting function, right, inside of our body, we're just printing hello. Okay, so anytime greeting is called, hello will be printed out onto our console. Okay. So again, this is another simple example, right? So technically we've made our first function, right? With the name called greeting. The body is just one line. This is printing hello. Okay. Very simple, very self-explanatory. You can also call other functions within a function that you defined, right? So if you've made, say, two functions and you can call one inside of another, that's perfectly fine. I'll show you guys an example of there's a little bit of there's one thing you have to remember when it comes to the order of when you or how you define functions in your code. So like I'll show you guys later, but it'll be just to clarify. So it, like I mentioned, it's important where you create your functions in your program. Okay. So technically you can create it anywhere. Okay. But a very good rule of thumb is, especially for our code and pretty much any code that you write, you want to define your functions at the top of your code and outside of any functions. Okay, you want to define them globally. You guys remember how we talked about global functions and like where we define them? You'd kind of define them in the same area, or define functions in the same area that you would a global function. Okay, this just allows it to be accessible by every part of your code. Okay, and it makes sure that your code knows what that function does when it's being called. Okay. If you were to define a function within a function, that function that you define would only be able to be called inside of that function. So if we define greeting within draw, we'd only be able to use greeting inside of draw. Okay. If we tried to use it in setup, we'd have a massive error. Okay. And then this is the syntax for calling our function. So this is just the name of our function, right? And then we just have the two curved brackets. You need these two curved brackets to tell Python that this is actually a function I'm calling and is not a variable. Okay, if you don't put those two brackets there, regardless if you have any parameters or not, you need to have them there so that Python knows that you're referring to the function that is greeting. Okay. Otherwise, it's going to look for a variable called function called greeting, and it's not going to be able to be called, or you're going to get an error. Okay. Before we get into exercise 1, I want to show you guys what I was talking about in terms of order of order of defining functions. So the nice thing, this is just a little example that I've created here. Okay, so we have 3 functions. We have our function say hi, which just prints hi, our function greet, which calls the function say hi, and then we have our main function that calls greet. Okay, and then at the bottom here, we're actually calling main. So main will get called, it's going to call greet, then it's going to call say hi, and then hi is going to print hi onto the board. If we run this, we can see hi is print out. Okay. The nice thing, the way the way Python reads functions, okay, when it reads your code, okay, remember when I said that Python reads everything line by line, starting to the top, goes all the way to the bottom, okay? If I were to do something like this, if I were to take this function and let's put it here, okay? Now, if these were variables and let's say greet, if I was saying greet's equal to hi, say hi or whatever, this would give us an error, okay? But when I run this code, and I'm going to change this just so you can see that it changes, right? We'll capitalize it. If we run this, you guys can see that there's no problem, okay? That's because the way Python reads these functions is when it sees like def, right? It's just saying what you're basically telling the computer is that like, hey, I've assigned this code to this name. Okay, so for example, for say hi, I've assigned this code to this name. And anytime I call this in the future, I want you to do this. Okay. Same sort of thing here with greet. Okay. But because I'm not actually calling the functions, what happens is Python starts here. It reads def greet. He says, okay, for greet, you want to call say hi. I don't know what say hi is yet. Keeps reading. Oh, now I've hit say hi, and say hi is just doing this. Okay, keeps continuing. Oh, main wants me to call this. Okay, call greet. Okay, I haven't actually called anything. I haven't had told Python to actually execute anything yet. I've just defined some functions that I will eventually use in my code. Okay, this is a function call. Okay, by this point, right, main needs to be defined. Okay, and therefore greet needs to be defined. Okay, greet is defined here, but it calls say hi. Is say hi defined by this point? It is. Okay. So you guys can see by the time I call these actual functions in my code, okay, they're actually defined by that point. Okay. So if I were to do say something like this, I could even put main at the top here, right? And run this, and it still runs, right? Let's change this just so you guys can see, right? You can see it still runs. Now, if I were to do something like this, if I were to put main here, take that out, we're going to get an error, okay? Because what's happening is Python has read this main function, and we've told Python that if you see main called, we want you to call greet, okay? Keeps reading, keeps reading, keeps reading. Oh, we found the definition of greet. It's calling say hi, okay? But now we're calling main. We're actually calling main. We're telling Python, I want you to call the main function and execute the code in it, okay? So, but at this point, we actually haven't defined what say hi does. So Python's going to give us an error, right? If you get errors like this, name error, name say hi is not defined, that means you need to rearrange your code a little bit so that by the time you're actually calling a function, Python already knows what's in it. Okay. That's an example of just kind of how Python reads code and what it does when it reads def. Okay. You won't run into this error if you define all of your functions, say like at the top of your code, right? So like I said, like how we did with global variables, if you do it like right after you call from processing import store, like in those early lines, you shouldn't really have any problems like this. Okay. But yeah, just be wary of that. Okay. If you're defining a function, just put it at the top of your code, make your life easy. Okay. That being said, let's get into our first exercise for the day. So we want you guys to create a random circle function. Okay. So we want the name of the function to be random underscore circle. Okay. And it gets called anytime the mouse is pressed. Okay. For the sake of this exercise and for the sake of simplicity, wherever you implement your code, just do like an if mouse pressed loop or an if mouse pressed statement, sorry. And that just calls your random circle. Don't redefine mouse pressed. You could, but it's a little bit more than you need to do. But here's some things about the function. So the function is to draw a circle at the mouse position with a random diameter. Okay, so range 25 to 75. I hope you guys remember how to use random. If you guys don't, ask your mentors. They'll explain it to you. Okay. Just a quick hint too, while you're getting into there, while you're doing your exercise, okay, think about how to get random colors. Okay, remember how we used fill and what each value inside the fill, each parameter in the fill function represents, right? And how many random numbers do you need to create for each color, right? So like, what's the range of numbers that you guys can have? Okay, think about those things. We're gonna go into this. We'll do it for about 15 minutes. We'll go into our breakout rooms, come back, and continue on. Okay, so let's get started.
All right, and before I open the breakout rooms, we're missing a couple of mentors today, so there is some significant shakeups for the groups today.
All right, guys. Just as you're coming in, you guys want to just let me know how you guys found that exercise. If you guys had any trouble? What was the overall feel after that one? I know my group, we kind of finished it pretty quick. But yeah, we're gonna go over a quick example here. Just wait till everyone gets in. Good. It's good to hear, Ryan. Thanks for your feedback. Anyone else? Anyone have any problems? Anyone struggle at all? Yes, no, maybe so. Okay. Let's also go over an example. So, if you guys didn't remember to use random, you need to import random. Okay. Setup's pretty standard, just making a background. Okay. Draw. This is kind of the only thing you needed, was a little if statement that checks if mouse pressed, and then you're going to call your function. Okay, so you guys can see here that we defined our function here called random ellipse, right? And for the colors, right, we're grabbing a random number between 0 and the reason we do 256, remember, random will give us a number between these two numbers, right? And since you can have values between that go from 0 to 255, right, we go one higher because the first value is inclusive, the second value is exclusive. So we won't get values of 256, but we will get values of 255. Okay. And then we do that for our red, our green, and our blue values. We get one for our diameter, right? So we go random int between 0 and 50. We add 25 onto it. That's just because of how it looks, right? Just to give it a certain look. And then we print out our circle. Okay, very simple. Just go around. I can just print as many circles as I want. Okay. Very easy, very simple. I mean, did anyone have any real trouble with this? It sounds like most of you guys got the understanding of how the function works. One thing I was going to note too is that run, if you guys remember that we don't define run here, but the reason we call it is this calls draw and setup. So you can, like, if you guys notice here, like ellipse, random ellipse is defined after it's after draw, and draw actually uses it. That's fine because remember, run calls draw and setup. So these two functions don't actually get executed till this line here, right? So you can define it anywhere, right? As long as it's before run, right? Any questions before we move on? No? Okay, perfect. Let's move on then. Okay, so now we're going to talk about parameters. Okay, so parameters are an optional variable that are used as inputs into the function. Okay, so the function body will treat these as normal variables. However, you don't set the value that you don't set the value parameters. The value that gets it's the value that gets passed into when the function is called. Okay, so whatever you define your, like, this is the syntax for parameters. Okay, and we're gonna see in the next slide or the next couple slides like how to actually use parameters. Okay, so when you define your parameters of your function, what you're essentially doing is that you're saying that for this function add, right, we're given two variable names, like alias names. Okay, like let's like basically you're saying like for this function add, we want to take in two values and whatever they may be, a and b. Okay, and what we're going to do with a and b is we're going to add them together and then print out the sum. Okay, so this function, basic functionality is just take two numbers, find the sum, and print them out. Okay. But like in our code, we're not going to set like a is equal to this and a equals to that. When we call add, right, this is how we call it. Okay, so add, and then we put 3 and 5. We can put any values. We could put other variable names in there. So like if we had variable 1, variable 2, we could put add variable 1, variable 2. That works as well. Okay, but what this is just saying is that like for a is going to be equal to 3, b is going to be equal to 5. Okay, is take whatever number has been put here and add it to this number here and return it. Okay, that's how parameters work. You're basically just setting an alias name. It's almost like, if you guys remember, like from math, if you have like a quadratic function, right, and you have, say, like y is equal to something x whatever, right, it's like saying for any x, right, y is going to equal this. This functions kind of work similar in the sense that like for any parameters, do this with these parameters. Okay, for these values. Okay, so that's how parameters work. Does that make sense to everyone? Any questions about that? We have a bit of time, so if you guys need to ask questions, feel free. Okay, this also brings us to our next question. Okay, so we want to fill in this blank. So we have def setup, and we have this function here called divide by 3. Okay, and it's going to compute the result of a number, divide by 3. We need to figure out what the values for blank 1 and blank 2 are going to be. Okay, so if you guys want to head over to Top Hat, I'll start that question now. Yeah, that question's live, so go ahead and answer it, guys. Think about how we just talked about parameters, how we call those functions with parameters. Okay, those are all key concepts for this question. Think about too, like what we're like. We'll go over the result and we'll show you guys. About 30 seconds left, guys. Okay, so that's time. Let's check your guys' responses. So most of you guys said B, which is indeed the correct answer. Okay, so The option for B was blank 1 was divide by 3 and blank 2 was number. Okay, so let's look at the function knowing that. So for blank 1, right, you guys can kind of see that we're calling some function, right? There's something that has to be here, and then we have our two curved brackets and some number inside the brackets, right? So that clearly indicates that we are calling a function. Okay, so the only functions that we have here are setup and divide by 3. We're inside the setup function when we're making a function call, so the only other real option is divide by 3. Okay, so that would be blank 1. For blank 2, and this is where I suspect maybe you guys had a little bit more trouble. For those of you who maybe didn't get it, get the right answer is well, like, what's the name of the parameter that we're using now? The best way I can describe this is that we have results here, and then we're printing the result. And we know that the name of our function is divide by 3. Remember when I said create function names that somewhat pertain to the functionality of that function, right? So in this function, right, the name is divided by 3. So we want to divide some number by 3, right? We don't want to divide a result by, we're not dividing our result by 3. Okay, result is the result, or in this case, the difference. Oh, no, sorry, not the difference, the quotient of whatever number we pass in divided by 3. And you guys can also see here that we're dividing some number by 3. Okay, we have to get this number from somewhere. Okay, the only place that we can get it from in this code is from the parameter. Okay, so that's how you know that, because we're not setting number equal to anything here. Okay, that's also another clear indication that that is the parameter name. Okay, that's the argument that we take in. Okay, does that make sense to everybody? Everyone understanding how parameters work now? And arguments, parameter arguments, same thing. Any questions? No? Okay, sweet. We'll move on. Okay, so we talked about the name, the body. Those two things are required. We talked about parameters. Those things are optional. Okay, that's optional. The last optional thing that we have is a value, a return value. Okay, now sometimes you could create a function that has a return value. Okay, real quick, there's one that we've used. Okay, and it's with list. Okay, can anyone think of a function we mentioned that was a function earlier in the lesson? Can anyone name that one function that I'm thinking of that returns a value and it has to do with list? Okay, does anyone have any ideas? You guys want to put in chat? We've had one that returns a value. Anyone take a guess as to what it is? Length, correct. Right, so you guys got it right. Length. Okay, length returns a value. Okay, and like this is very useful where, you know, if we want to say compute something or we need to get a value, but the code to get that value is a little extensive, right? Or we repeat it multiple times, right? This is where a function that returns a value is very useful. Okay, just a note, return values can be anything. Okay, so you can return strings, you can return list, you can return numbers, which can be integers, doubles. Okay, one note though, a function can only have one return, like can only return one value. So if you have in your code, like if you have return value, once it hits that return, the function will stop. Okay, it won't execute code after. Okay, so if you need, like, sometimes you can have conditional statements where you have like if this return this, or if this return that, or elif or else return this kind of type thing. That's okay, because you'll return either or, right? But if you have like return this in like consecutive lines, you're only going to return the first one. You can only return once with the function. Okay. This is just an example. So here's a function that returns an integer value. Okay, so we're just going to return this function just returns 2 plus 2. Okay, so when this function is called, right, we set this variable answer is equal to 2 plus 2. Okay, and then we're just going to return our answer. We know that's 4. Okay, and then inside of our setup function, okay, we're saying x is equal to 2 plus 2. It returns 4, and then we're going to print 4 or x plus 1, which is going to be 4 plus 1, which is going to print 5. Okay. Yeah, you can use that. That's basically the most common way to use functions with return values. Okay. Another way would be either like you could return a Boolean value like true or false, like mouse press does, or key press does, where it returns true or false, and you can use those with like if statements or while loops and stuff like that. That works as well. Okay. So to build on that, this brings us to our next exercise. Okay. So we want to create a function named average that returns the average of inputs x and y. Okay. So it's going to return a value. Okay. When the mouse is pressed, okay, we want to call average and pass the mouse x and y in as parameters. So not only you're going to have to need a return statement, you're also going to need 2 parameters that go into the function as well. Okay. We want to draw an ellipse at the position of the mouse with the return value of average as its diameter. So whatever value average returns, that's what we're going to use as the diameter of our ellipse. Okay. Remember that the diameter is the average of the x and y. Okay. What variables should be returned from the function? Okay. And how can you store the return value and use it to draw circles, right? So how do you actually use the return value from a function? Keep that in mind. Okay. And just one little note too, the average between two values is just the sum divided by 2. Okay. So we'll do another 15 minutes on this exercise, come back, go over the solution, and then there's a couple more things, and then that'll be it. Any questions before we head into the breakout rooms? No? Okay, perfect. Let's get the breakout rooms going. I'll see you guys in 15 minutes. All right. Just as you guys are coming back in, again, just let me know how the exercise went, how you guys felt it went, or if you guys had any trouble, anything like that. I know my group again kind of blew through it with flying colors. But yeah. Okay, looks like mostly everyone's here. So let's go over a solution. So again, the from processing import star and the setup functions are pretty self-explanatory. But similar to the previous exercise, the first one we did, inside a draw, we're just checking if mouse is pressed. Okay, and then this is kind of what the meat of the exercise is. So we have our function here, average, okay? And it takes in 2 values, okay? And it just returns the average between them, okay? So you guys can see that it takes in 1 and 2 parameters, okay? And then returns the sum of them divided by 2. So when you have arithmetic statements like this, guys, you can just put it on one line, okay? Will return the sum of them, okay? But I do recommend, like, if you have a lot of math to do, right, for something, do it on multiple lines and then just set it to like a final return value and then return that value. Like set it to like an answer and then return that. Just looks a little bit cleaner. It's easier to read and then there's less chance of errors occurring. Okay, but in this case, the arithmetic is very, very simple and short. So we can just do it on one line, just return the value that we get from taking the sum and dividing by 2. So we know that's what average does. Okay, so now we're gonna actually use it. So we have this variable d, okay, and we're gonna set it equal to average of mouse x and mouse y. So we're actually gonna put in mouse x and mouse y as our values, as our a and b into our function. And then d, because we're set it equal to average of these values, we're actually D will be set to the return value that we get from average when we put in those two values. Okay. Once we've done that, everything else is pretty self-explanatory. We have our no fill. We just want a ring for the circles. It's just for looks and show. And then we create our ellipse at the mouse X and Y values, and then at the D value that we got from average. So if we run this, we can just see, right, the bigger into the corner I get, the smaller, or sorry, the more down right I go, the bigger the circle, right? Because that's when the X and Y are at their max. And then if we go to the top left, they get smaller. Okay, very simple, right? Does anyone have any questions about parameters at all? Parameters, return values, anything like that? No? Okay. So let's move on. So one quick note before we get into the assignments. Okay. You can also use global functions like we have done with setup and draw before inside your functions as well. Okay. Right, like if we have like a take damage function, like for a game, for example, right? And like we might need to alter health, the player's health in other functions. So it's a good idea to make that a global function. We just need to make sure that when we want to say decrease the health, because you've taken damage, right? We need to make sure that we're using the right health, the right variable, right? The global version, right? Very simple, very similar to what we've done before. That's just how you would do it. Okay. All right. So, let's get into the exercises, and then we have a couple things to do. What's it called? A couple of things we need to we have like our end of session questions, and then we also have one more thing for you guys, just a quick form. But let's go over the exercises for this week. So, for bug busters, okay, I believe all the assigned exercises that we are giving you guys this week are very similar to, if not the same as ones before, but how we want you guys to implement it is different. Okay, so we want you guys to use functions when doing these things. Okay, so for bug busters, the first one is we want you guys to create a function that creates a little face like that every time the mouse is clicked and at the position that the mouse is clicked. Okay. And then we also want you to use a function to create abstract art. If you guys go into the slides for these, okay, we actually have notes that kind of specify what you're supposed to do. I'll try and zoom into these here, right? But so like for number one with the smiley faces, like we want you guys to make a function that draws the scared face whenever you click your mouse. And these are just some things to consider, okay? Like we want to know like what shapes compose, like what shapes do you need, what variables can you use to detect the mouse position, and how do we make it so that each face remains like where do you put the background function, right? Some things to think about. For the second one, for the abstract art, we want you guys to create a function called abstract art, and a parameter is number of rectangles. Okay, when the mouse is pressed, generate a number between 0 and 200 and call abstract art, right? Passing a random number as a parameter. The function should loop to draw rectangles with random position, right? So you got to use your loops a little bit with a random position, size, and color. So you're gonna use a lot of random here, okay? And then the function should draw as many rectangles as the value passed into the function, right? So you're gonna need to use that value that you pass in your loops somewhere, okay? For Pythonic lava, let's just look at these here. We are this is the what's it called? We have the car lane one that prints out where the car is depending on which lane it is. So if it's in the left lane, prints left lane, so on. For this one here, it's creating the bullseyes. And again, there's the speaker notes here. So for number 3, for the bullseye one, create a function that draws a dartboard given the X and Y position and size. So given a specific size, the number of rings depend on the size of the dartboard. Okay, so it should be proportional. And call this function 3 times instead of draw, using different parameters for each one. So you're just going to call that function 3 times, parameters, as long as they're different, there's no real specific ones that you need to call. Just make sure that they're kind of different for each one, right? For the last one, for the car lane one, right? Create a function called find lane that accepts one parameter, which would be the X position of the car, right? Because that's the one thing that actually changes or that you need to check. Okay. The function return one of the three strings depending on the X position. Okay. So if you guys look in the example here, right? You guys only need to return a string that specifies the lane. Okay. You can just print car is in. Okay. And then whatever the return value is from the return value from that function should be either left lane, middle lane, or right lane. Okay. Again, this is all in speaker notes, so if you forget, just go to the functions, go to the speaker notes. They'll be all there. Okay. Use the return value from find lane function to print in the text car is in, and then your lane, right? And then use the mouse position to control the car. You don't need to detail the car. It's not necessarily a simple rectangle works as well. Okay, that we're not testing your guys' example to make a car, a super detailed car. We want you guys to work with functions and understand how they work. Okay. There's a couple optional ones for fun as well. So we have this one here that creates a circle that's proportional to the side to the amount of time held. Okay. And then we also have one that what's it called? That creates a rectangle between 2 points. Okay, and also prints out the area of that rectangle. Okay. And then so one other thing I wanted to do too, guys, is we're asking you guys to if you guys could take a few minutes to fill out a feedback form so that we guys can hear what you guys have to say about these sessions so far. Okay. So I'll actually grab the link here and I'll put it in chat. If you guys could open it and then post it somewhere. Or sorry, fill it out. Okay. It's very similar to the submission forms that you guys have for submitting your assignments. Okay, you don't need to submit anything, you just need to fill it out, submit it on the website, and there you go. But we would love to hear from you guys. We want to hear you guys hear if there's anything we need to improve on, if what you guys like, right? We want to make this as best as possible for you guys. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Before we go as well, we have our end of session top hat questions. Let me just find these here. So if you guys want to head over to Top Hat, we have 2. The first one is live. If you would like to go and answer that quickly, please. What time is it now? Okay, it's 1:30 now. So I'm gonna give about a minute each for these. If you guys can answer those as quickly as possible, that would be huge. And then then it will be questions. If you guys have questions now, you guys can ask them as well. Okay, seems like everyone's answered. So I'm going to move on to the next question. Okay, and then the next question is up as well, guys. If you guys don't mind answering that one as well, please. That would be awesome. Just a quick note too, that the feedback form that I put in the chat, it's very short. It takes like a minute or 2 to fill out. And we like I said, we'd greatly appreciate it. It'd be awesome to hear how you guys feel the sessions have been, going. and if there's anything that you would like to see in the sessions. Still waiting on a couple people to answer. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and close that. Thank you guys for answering those. And that pretty much brings us to the end of the session, guys. So if you guys have any questions, now's the time to answer them. If you don't, have a great weekend. We'll see you guys next week. Let us know again if you have any problems. Please, please, please fill out that form that we gave you guys. It would, like I said, means a lot to us if you guys do. But other than that, have a great weekend. And yeah. Welcome, guys.
All right, looks like it's just us left now, so let's get through this. All right, so on my end, seems like we had no technical difficulties today. We do have that mentor feedback form, so if you guys could fill that out, I would appreciate that. And we also got the mentee feedback form, so thanks, Cohen. And yeah, I'll just go in the order that I see on this list here. Blue Baba.
Um, yeah, yeah, so I think my mentees today, they were pretty engaged, like they were asking a lot of questions. A lot of them were kind of struggling with functions. They were kind of having a hard time understanding like where to define them and how the return values work, but I was able to explain it to them, and then I think they got it. Um, but yeah, other than that, yeah, everything else was okay. The pace was good.
Great, thank you, Melanie.
Yeah, kind of similar to Lubaba. One of my mentees was kind of struggling with the functions and like just return values and sort of where to put things, but I was able to clear it up with him, and he seemed to understand it by the second exercise, so that was good. Other than that, it was pretty quiet in the breakout rooms. Not a lot of engagement, but I think they seemed to understand, and they were able to complete the exercises.
Good to hear, thank you. Devin.
Yeah, this week my mentees definitely understood it pretty well. That most of them seem to have experience with functions already, so it was pretty easy. And the pacing of lecture was fine, I thought.
Great, thank you. Talha.
Today they're a lot more engaged. My camera wasn't working, so that was kind of an issue, but I just shared my screen to make up for it and then went through the exercise with everyone, asked every mentee, like called them out by name just to like make sure they're on track. Some didn't really respond, but most of them did. And yeah, it was a good session.
Okay, good to hear that your engagement went up. Ibrahim.
My mentees didn't really struggle with the material. I was asking them some questions and they seemed to understand and they're getting the exercises done. So that was good. And then yeah, I was also able to get them to fill out the form.